All right. Once again, I want to remind everyone that I'm going to do a real quick introduction of our speakers. Each of our speakers is going to, in turn, present, and then with your questions. Please put your questions in the box or any responses that you may have with respect to the topic. Um, at this time, I want to thank the John Humphrey Center for allowing the Japanese community, especially the National Association of Japanese Canadians, to have an opportunity to speak about redress and some of the other political actions that are happening in Canada with the Japanese community. I'm quite excited to have Art Miki and Marika Omatsu, who were part of the actual redress, as well as Susan Tabata, who has been working with the BC government on an additional redress with the government itself. And we also want to thank our rapporteurs and volunteers in the background with the John Humphrey Center who will be helping us, and especially to Ed and Jessica who've been helping us with technical issues. And a big thanks to Renee for bringing all of us together to be able to talk about human rights in general. I want to quickly introduce Art, who is um, going to speak first, then Marika and Suzanne, and I'll let each of you go ahead and begin our conversation. So, Art?
Well, thank you, Hitomi, and certainly welcome to all the people who are listening this afternoon. Uh, I'm going to just talk from my experience with regard to the Japanese Canadian redress settlement that took place on September 22nd of 1988. And I have to admit, we learned a lot through that experience in terms of establishing practices that make a successful political action. And so I'd like to just touch on some of those. First of all, uh, you need to establish clear objectives. And in our case, our objective was to get redress for those victims of the internment. The question is, what kind of redress were we looking for? And because it's such a touchy area, and I know that in the early experience, mentioning words such as individual compensation in terms of the Canadian public, we felt would not go over very well. So in the end, our main basic message that we established was that we wanted a negotiated settlement. Negotiated meaning both parties, both the government and the National Association, would be satisfied. And to us, that was likely the safest position for us to take, because I know through experience and then even talking to politicians that I remember talking to Sergio Marchi from the Liberal Party, and I said to him, if we were to have gone to you about getting individual compensation, how would your party have reacted? And he said it would have been a hard sell. So, in essence, we took the position that if we can get a negotiated settlement, that would be the best position for us. And we could go to both the opposition parties with that position. So, both the NDP caucus as well as the Liberal caucus both supported us when it came to a negotiated settlement. We didn't talk about the contents of the settlement, but it was how the process by which we arrived at it. So that was an important lesson for us to know. Secondly, one of the things that we wanted to, our biggest difficulty was getting support from our own community. Many of our community members reacted against even us seeking redress, feeling that as a result of our actions, they were going to be ostracized, they would be more racism drawn towards them. They were afraid of the backlash from other people. And so there was a reluctance for us to go forward. And I think the other part of it is because we are a small community. At that time, we were about 60,000 in Canada. And so many of our people said, well, you know, the government isn't going to listen to you at all. We're really not. Uh, uh, in terms of political action, we would not carry any weight at all. And so what would be the benefit of politicians supporting us? So those are some of the issues that came up. And we have to overcome that difficulty. And top of that, when you take a community even small as ours, you run into conflicts. There are some people who want certain kinds of compensation. There were others who didn't want individual compensation. They only wanted group compensation. There were many people who said, just get an apology. That would be satisfactory. So in other words, there's a diversity of opinions, and to try to bring that all together becomes a real problem. In the end, we were able to do that. We conducted a national survey, and it gave us a better picture of where our community stood. But as you listen to different individuals, they have different views. And so that's one of the things that you need to overcome, is to have a message that everyone in your community could follow. And certainly the idea of negotiated settlement was one that most people had no difficulty with. The other thing that we did in terms of the process is look for precedents. We were charting new territory really in Canadian law here, because there was no example of any class action suits against the government. And even though we weren't taking the government to court, as an organization, it was like a class action effort on our part. And there were no examples of that in Canada. We found some that related to certainly the Holocaust, and there were examples in the United States where there were some awards made. But in Canada, that was new territory. And so that was one of the difficult situations. And I think our situation turned once the American government passed a redress bill in August of '88, giving Japanese Americans individual compensation of $20,000. And so that became a real precedent for our government then to have to revise or change their position. It's important that when you negotiate or when you meet with governments, you have a clear message. And so it was important that we designated one person to give the message when it came to, I was placed in that role as president. But if you allow other people to speak, you have different messages. It confuses people. It certainly gives the government an opportunity then to divide the community as well. So it's important that you have a clear message delivered in such a way that you have a chief spokesman for your organization. I think the other part is to ensure that you remain on message. In other words, if you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, you don't divert from it. In other words, there are times when you have to actually say, no, that's not acceptable. And to give you a good example is when we met with David Crombie, at one point he said, this is the last offer. If you reject it, that's the end of your redress movement. And basically, we made a decision to walk away. And I know members of my community, some of them said after, why didn't you accept it? Why didn't you accept just a community compensation of $12 million that they were offering? But we said but that wasn't the intent. We had a specific goal, and so we stayed with it. So it's important that you don't divert from your message. However, it's important that you begin to explore other strategies. And that's what we had to do when we walked away from David Crombie and the government's last offer. We had to change our strategy, and we met, and America was part of this, where we set up a different approach. We said, let's make this a Canadian human rights issue, and we'll go to the Canadian public. And so America will be talking about that, I suspect. But it was important that you have some flexibility in terms of, because up to that point, it was only the NHIC and the government meeting, and we didn't involve other people. But once we got expanded that tent, then it really helped us. So those are some of the issues that we did. I'm just trying to Um, I think the part that is important is what America would be sharing in terms of how we had to redefine ourselves in terms of an organization and our goals. So I'm going to stop at that point and then turn it over to America.
America, you want to turn your mic on, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session. Art and I thought we would speak about the 1988 redress settlement, and he would speak about organizing in the Japanese Canadian community, and I would talk to you about things we learned about organizing in the outside our community. And what gave me the idea that we had to do this was when we met in 1986 with the then Minister of Multiculturalism, David Crombie. And he said, I don't need to pay you guys more than, he was then, I think, offering $12 million because you're an old issue. Nobody cares about you. Nobody knows about what you're talking about. And there's no pressure on me to do anything. And I told my husband, Frank Cunningham, who was involved in all kinds of political actions against the war in Vietnam and for the peace movement. And he said, you've got to take your case to the people. And that's basically what we decided we had to do. So in the next 2 years, that's what we did. And in Toronto, Roger Obata, unfortunately, he is no longer with us, and I were the Toronto representatives. And Roger was mostly concerned with our community, and I was to be concerned with the non-JC community. And what we decided was that we had to win the media over to get our story out. Because one thing Crombie said is nobody knows about you. So one thing that Roger and I did was we went to visit all the newspapers. The most important newspaper at the time in Canada, it was the Toronto Globe and Mail. So we went and made a presentation to their editorial board. We were surrounded by a group of old white men, and they were totally stone-faced. They made no reaction to what we said, so we had no idea what they were thinking. Then we went to the editorial board of the Toronto Star, which is a more populist newspaper and has a bigger circulation. And that was a totally different reception. And Don Seller, who was on the editorial board, was an early fan of our community and our cause. And they immediately started writing editorials and articles supporting the government, supporting us and urging the government to negotiate a just settlement. Our last visit was with the editorial board of the Toronto Sun, and they're known as a tits and ass newspaper and more hardcore people. And we knew that would be a tough sell. And we were not surprised when they had an editorial saying, pay them compensation for their lost property. They didn't think that we should get compensation for being incarcerated and removed from the province of British Columbia because it was during the war. Then the Globe and Mail came out and they endorsed a negotiated settlement. So we were very pleased with that. Then we thought, well, we've got to get city councils on our side. So I made a presentation to the Toronto City Council and other National Association of Japanese Canadian reps went to Vancouver. I guess it must have been Roy Miki and Cassandra Kobayashi. And also somebody went to Lethbridge. And we got those city councils to endorse our campaign. Then I had good relations with many ethnic minority communities since I have been a community activist. So I met with the Chinese community, CCNC, and they were very supportive. The Jewish community, the Italian community, the Black community, and the Southeast Asian community. And sometimes I and Roger made presentations to their national executive boards, and they gave us their support. We then thought, or my husband, Frank, said, well, you should get some important Canadians, like get all the important Canadians to support your cause. So we formed an ad hoc committee on Japanese Canadian redress. And the first people we got were the old friends who had supported us after the war. And they were members of the CCF, and people like Reverend Cyril Powell's got all the churches on board. So we had all the churches, and they offered, the Canadian Council of Churches, to donate a Globe and Mail ad, and then offer tax receipts for any donations. And the ad that we placed in the Globe and Mail said in 1942, the Canadian government sent some kids to camp. And it showed a little boy in an incarceration camp in 1942. And that ad, which was a full page in the Globe and Mail, had all important signatories like Margaret Atwood and you name it. And those people signed and their names were there. And that was a very powerful message and ad. We organized a Toronto Forum in October 1987, and 20 ethnic groups representing 9 million Canadians were involved in that. Their organizations represented 9 million people. And art was very important in this one. In April 14, 1988, when we had a Freedom Day rally in Ottawa. And we delivered 14,000 postcards to the Prime Minister's office from Japanese Canadians, across Canada. And people, even like my brother, Rick Omatsu, who lived in Hamilton, who's a very shy kind of guy, who had been afraid because he had been incarcerated as a young child, to participate openly, was surprised when he went door to door on his street and he got all his neighbors to sign postcards. He told me he was shocked that they would do that. And that's the kind of reception we got. And ordinary members of our community, I think, had the reaction of my brother. So all of this was sort of leading up to our final days, but Art has mentioned, when we started negotiating in the last weeks of the summer and September. We had been negotiating for years, from 1980 to 1988, but it was just basically meeting a series of multiculturalism ministers. But this time was different. And as Art mentioned, on September 22, 1988, we reached a deal with the government and we won redress. So I think slightly over $400 million, $21,000 per survivor, $12,000 for a race relations foundation, which was matched by the federal government, and $12 million for a community fund. And another thing that we had been working on was the repeal of the War Measures Act, because everything that had been done to us was deemed to be legal by the courts because of pursuant to the War Measures Act. And we were successful, along with other communities and organizations, of course, to have that act repealed and replaced by a new Emergency Powers Act, which had charter rights embedded in the act. And so that was very important. One thing that was very important as well about our settlement is that for the first time in Canadian history, individuals got compensation for a group wrong. And that opened the door for organizations like the Thalidomide Children, Aboriginal First Nations to go for residential schools. Before that, if there was a group wrong, you would get a statue or a foundation. And so this was really a big opening in Canadian law. And this is kind of remarkable given that in 1942, we were one of the smallest ethnic groups in the country. And even today, we're only 129,000. So somebody said we're mighty, even though we're small. Thank you.
Suzanne, I think is next. Suzanne, you'll need to unmute, please.
Here we go. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Well, this is such an interesting presentation because I feel as though I'm presenting to Art, America, and Hitomi, not knowing what is out there in that blank space. So thank you very much, Hitomi, for inviting myself and Art America to this very special afternoon. And I have to say, I am quite humbled to be on this particular panel following Art and America, who I must say, first and foremost, are the guiding lights behind the BC Redress Initiative, and without whom I don't think we would have had the strength to continue with this particular political process. And I'm going to try and wrap things super quickly around a flagpole and bring things to BC Redress by saying that I think listening to Art and listening to America, I need to speed up into the 2020s. We're now in the 21st century, where we are dealing with a very different communication mode, living in a digital age where you can rapidly be taken down very, very quickly by political opponents, societal opponents, etc. So I wanted just to contextualize the work in this environment, and to also contextualize the BC activity within a provincial setting as opposed to a federal setting. However, understanding first and foremost that the 22,000 Japanese Canadians living in the coastal areas of British Columbia who were forcibly uprooted, incarcerated, dispossessed, and forcibly dispersed landed in all different parts of this country. And there is no action or negotiation that can take place that ignores the population outside of the province of British Columbia. And that presents with it a whole raft of very, very tricky political and legal things to get around. And I want to address some of that maybe very, very quickly as I go through this. I wanted to say that the that the BC initiative took as a precedent the federal initiative of the Japanese Canadian federal redress, because to America's point, that was the first time that this kind of political action led to a settlement. And in fact, when we did our own research to see what kind of levers we could pull within the provincial government, our researcher at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy in Ottawa pulled out the federal redress for Japanese Canadians as a sample, and other samples as well. So what I want to talk about is quickly how the best practices worked or are working with the BC government today. And there's a couple of things that are on our side. When we were able to get through with a commitment from the BC government we did not have any political opposition. And while we understand there's political opposition that we're always mindful of, we built our package in a way that it would be inoculated against the lens of a partisan viewpoint. So everything that we built was going to be good for community, good for society, good for people in BC. I think that having the president of the NAJC's risk-taking mode was really great. And I see that there's two things that are at play here. One, you have an NAJC that is willing to risk all to make a point, which is an NAJC that does its best work when it can actually hang itself on the end of a diving board and say, hey, we're here, this is wrong, this is what we stand for. And I think that is a key ingredient when you're bringing an issue before anybody, because as Art said in his opening remarks, who's interested in supporting this from the community, really? You know, who wants to go against the grain and make that work for yourself? So it's the NAJC first of all, and Art America and others involved. They were involved before I got involved with a swimming upstream video that America had done, outlining all the making a legal case for what the BC government had done, and that there needed to be some type of a redress that came out of it. And also from the very, very, I would say, brief but at least meaningful community consultations which took place in 2018. Well, I guess through 2019, and then were delivered on November 15th, 2019 to the BC government. And although the BC government kind of poked a lot of holes in that document because they didn't say it was specific enough for asks, what we got out of it were a lot of thematic interest from the community and what was important for the community writ large, even in our small sample size of 700 across Canada. So again, coming back to the use of the NAJC, or the value of having an organization that has ties throughout the country, I think that made the mobilization part of this work so much easier than in the 1988, or what led to the 1988 federal redress activity, because all that ground was laid decades ago. So this is really important to it's an important consideration to make. Secondly, though, I think that, you know, what I was able to bring to it perhaps was communication strategy and understanding the importance of government relations, and the communication strategy in the 21st century, and at least now, is you got to keep quiet and do your work very, very, deftly, sort of behind closed doors, and build political alliances and so forth, but also understand opinion polls. You know, how do certain types of initiatives sit with certain types of demographics within the province, and building it to be accepted in BC was the most important thing, even though the benefits going outside of the province, this is BC taxpayer money. So we went pretty heavily into opinion research, even though some of it was, you know, somewhat anecdotal. There was just this working and walking knowledge of how to present and how to navigate in this new digital environment that we're in. And that was to keep things really, really close and really, really tight. And what we did was build a business case so that we had a historical wrongs package that wasn't giving cash to individuals, but it was a historical wrongs package that was paying out certain funds to certain things that we could legally and morally argue. So there were six pillars that evolved. Some of this came from the initial document that America had been working on in 2019, and then it was also adapted to crystallize clear initiatives. And we did, first of all, with education, the feedback that we got was it wasn't that you need a teacher resource, you need to teach teachers how to teach this topic, and you need to make sure that it becomes a very, very clear and easy uptake across the country, but formidably within the province of BC, because we're being funded through BC, and it was the ministers of education and advanced education who supported this presentation that we made, and Art was actually part of that education presentation. So that education piece became very crystallized, very clear, and also to our community's history, we'd had a number of Japanese Canadians, Masako Fukawa being one, who had gone before the BC government historically, even within the last 15, 20 years, and had asked for funds for learning resources and to be put, to be given some funding for the teaching of this particular type of history. And she had been rejected and others had been rejected. And so we were fighting hard against that earlier rejection to argue that in the 1940s, in fact, 2.6% of the total population of British Columbia was of Japanese descent, highly succeeding in many, many different types of resource-based industries and farming and shopkeeping, etc. And the community, scattered throughout the province, was really becoming a really economic threat to the status quo at the time and the dominant culture. So we kept on coming back to this, and also saying that due process was denied to the community in the 1940s. So due process must be given to the community as we're trying to work through what a meaningful package would be. So beyond education, we also talked about anti-racism, and this really was really big for the NAJC folks and Judy, and I don't know, the folks that are on the call today. Certainly we know Judy and others that have been involved, Lynn Kobayashi, others. The anti-racism piece was quite different. It wasn't a monetary one. It was really an ask that was to be included at the table for policy development and anti-racism initiative policy development or social policy that would look at the ways in which not only Japanese Canadians, but other marginalized groups, right, are in fact excluded or discriminated against within systemic systems and structures. And so this idea of being involved in the conversation around systemic racism was very important to the NAJC. And in fact, in our work and during our time working with the government, the BC government in fact created a parliamentary secretary for multiculturalism and anti-racism initiatives, whose responsibility is to look at this file. And that happened after we began the conversation and after we actually told the government, you need to have some kind of a body that deals with this type of thing. So whether we had that influence or whether it was in the works, that's what the province did. And it made that work much easier moving forward. So the Premier has acknowledged, of course, beyond the apology of 2012 that Naomi Yamamoto led with the BC government, the Premier did acknowledge in May 21, 2022, in front of a number of community members, probably some on the call today, and certainly Art America, what those wrongs were. So that was good. So that's two. We have education, anti-racism. We also argued that while there's been some heritage work done for where the community was sent, right, like internment centers, etc., there really hasn't been a lot done beyond some general knowledge of Steveston and the downtown Powell Street area. There wasn't a lot of funding given to really talk about sites of origin and where the community actually came from. And from a heritage point of view, wouldn't it be good to do some work and put some funding into these places that Japanese Canadians used to call home and have their schools and build their businesses, etc. And that, in fact, was the turnkey for funding for heritage sites, even though the Nikkei Museum got some funding and Nikkei Internment Memorial Center got funding as well. And on the two big ones that are actually accessible to Japanese Canadians outside of the province of British Columbia, it's very important to drive home that we really worked on the loss of identity theme, which is there's a lot of that context within, I call it America's document, but the document that was created in 2019 by the NAJC, this idea of a community that was dispersed, scattered, lost its connection to its roots. And that loss of identity can be highly attributed to the BC government's role in advocating for everything that happened to the community. And we argued the loss of identity and built into that the argument for a community fund that could be managed and where grants could be dispersed across a variety of streams. And that is currently underway right now. And finally, we did argue also for a health support grant for seniors. And that is because we were able to get some very good research done at the federal level through this Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy, looking at other case studies, looking at the Indigenous scenarios where they felt that the community or the survivors actually suffered harm, and that a health support grant really is a way to give something for that harm that they suffered. I sort of wrap things up by saying that unlike the federal redress, I've been told even as recently as 2 weeks ago by our government colleagues, and we're still working on aspects of this settlement, which is why I'm quite careful about talking about some of the detail. But we have been told that we cannot call what we do redress because the BC government has not fully redressed the wrongs to Indigenous peoples in the province of British Columbia. Until such time as that is done, this matter is open for the work between the Indigenous populations in British Columbia and the government in BC. But what we can call this are legacy initiatives. And so that's why the NAJC did allow for a new society to be created that could oversee and provide governance to the funds that were being allocated to these very specific pillars under which there are programs. And we report every 3 months quantitatively and qualitatively to the BC government under the JC Legacy Society, which has to have on its small board one NAJC member at all times, who is currently Les Kojima, who is the president of the NAJC. And I'm in a staffing position with a small staff, and we're running the programs. So that's sort of how it landed. But this started absolutely at the NAJC. And I just want to say that without taking risk, you don't get anywhere. And there were many times coming back to Art America because they sat sort of in the background and really provided guidance and feedback to sort of the ongoing ups and downs of this. And let me say, this was not a straight line, and it hasn't been. It's been crooked, broken, circular, going nowhere, spiraling, etc. But it was really wonderful to have them in the background going, you can't settle for a handshake. You can't settle for a photo op. This is not about a photo op, and this is something more than that. And the more that some of our government relations that we had pushed back, the more committed I actually came to doing this work. It's like, well, come on, what are you talking about? Let's get back at it. So we did it over COVID, which is another huge thing. It really helped to have some government relations in place. Some were good, some were not so good. We were lucky that we had a BC government with a premier and a chief of staff who were so committed to this community and understood the historical wrongs, because we're not a voter bloc in the province, and nobody would tell you that matters, but let's face it, it does. Yeah, so I think that those are the big takeaways of the work. It is ongoing. Currently, it's ongoing. We still have $38 million that we're wiggling through at the moment. Highly emphasized of the community pillar to include a community space and this monument in Victoria. But that's kind of the short stroke of it. That's all I can really mention. But the final thing, I guess, what I want to say is the historical wrongs framework that we set up through a series of meetings and presentations around these key pillars is now being used as a historical wrongs framework by the province of British Columbia with its other groups that are seeking some form of compensation, for what they suffered under the hands of the BC government. So we thank those who came before us, and Art in America is so honored to be on this call to be able to thank you both, and thank the NAJC for its continued place, and it should continue to do that work because it's uniquely positioned to do that, whereas other organizations who rely on government funding are in a more risk-averse position. We brought in those people to form a big tent, but they didn't have the same ability to take those risks and to really, really go out on a limb. That's it.
Well, thank you, Art, Erica, and Suzanne. I've put a note in the chat about putting in questions and your thoughts. I do have a couple of questions for the three of you, and chime in. You'll have to undo your mic. The first question is that many people ask and this was especially with the initial redress, it's very difficult to keep people motivated and keep them on board for a campaign like this. And so I guess one of the questions I have is how do you keep people motivated? What was the factor that you think may have been the linchpin that helped move people forward on the redress?
Well, maybe I could respond partly to that, Hitomi. As I mentioned earlier, many people in our community did not support redress for fear of backlash and all of those things. But I think what helped was to have what we call community or house meetings, where we would gather a small group of people and we just talk about what happened to them during the war. And through that discussion, they became to realize that perhaps what happened to them shouldn't have happened with all the research that exists after Sainte Agathe's book, The Politics of Racism. And I think that understanding helped them realize that perhaps what happened to them should have not happened. And therefore, they tended to feel more support for what we're trying to do. But it was these small gatherings, because Japanese people don't want to talk in public too much about what happened. There's a reluctance to do that, but in a small group, they certainly were willing to share. And so it was that type of process that really helped, I think, in developing a core group of people who became more supportive. And I think the other area that really helped was the media that America referred to. They were doing all kinds of stories of individuals and their experiences. And that allowed other Canadians to understand what happened. Even as early as '85, I appeared on Front Page Challenge, and redress for Japanese Canadians was one of the topics that they had to. So it was that kind of exposure that really helped us. I think once our community began to realize the other Canadians who are supportive of us didn't feel as fearful about the backlash. So that's so good. Like maybe America, you were involved in it too. So maybe your comments in Toronto, I know there were a lot of meetings.
Well, I think what Art said is correct. Our community lacked self-confidence. Individuals lacked self-confidence. I'm what we call a sansei, a third generation Japanese Canadian, and my parents never spoke to me about what had happened to them. And I had no idea why we were so poor. And I didn't know that the government had taken everything away that my father had built up. His business, his house, his car, everything. And so that when they ended up kicked out of the province of BC and in Hamilton, we had nothing. And it was those meetings and the press and the ethnic groups supporting us that gave people confidence to say what happened was wrong. And other Canadians think that it was wrong. And I think that was important.
Suzanne, do you have any comments?
Yeah, well, it's funny that, Art's talking about being in the media, and we're talking about staying out of the media in this strategy, in this time that we're living in now. And in fact, our best work right now is to keep our head down and do the work, because in today's environment, we all can think about 5 urgent needs that Canadians or British Columbians face that far surpass whether or not Japanese Canadians can honor the farming community in Haney and Maple Ridge with a appropriate dedication. So we're really cautious of that. Things are tight. People can't afford groceries. There's big healthcare system issues, et cetera, et cetera. You all know that. And so on my corner of my eye, I'm looking at Kevin Higa's question. Hi, Kevin. I guess you're out there. It's funny not to be able to see anybody, by the way. He's asking that question about how do you share your knowledge to other marginalized groups. And, I start with pick up Art's book, come on, right? Or any of the redress books that have been written on the earlier Japanese Canadian redress. Thematically, that still applies, right? That still applies. But understand, I think, the context of where we're living in today. It's 2023. It's a different media environment. It's a different political environment, and just be aware of how quick things can snap into different directions. But I do know that there are a number of people in the Human Rights Committee, and I'm aware of Judy's work and the JVJCCA in Vancouver, who have already talked to a marginalized group, sharing experiences that they've gone through to help them with their advocacy pieces. But I would say build a business case. That's what I would do.
It told me I was.
One thing that I did after redress was I wrote my book, Bittersweet Passage, in 1992 as a sort of primer, setting out the kinds of things that we had to go through and the roadblocks that we had faced. And the Chinese Canadian community used that in their head tax case. And I think that we can share our experience and our knowledge. Art and I've been involved with all kinds of community organizations to talk about our experience. Art. Sorry.
Yeah. One of the things I'd like to pick up, I was looking at Kevin's question, and I know even during the time of the residential school issue, I was asked by the Grand Chiefs, both Ovid McCurdy and Phil Fontaine, to work with their committee when they were first starting off to even explore it. And listening to and meeting with the Indigenous group, uh, they were going through the same process we did. Initially, the elders in their community did not want this to be brought up. And in fact, when I met with the committee that was charged to look into it, they were getting threats from their own community asking them to drop the case against the churches and the government. But as time went on, that changed. And when Phil Fontaine was the Grand Chief, he invited me several times to appear before their groups, mainly because at that time the government was not recognizing, they were prepared to compensate uh, Indigenous students who were sexually and physically abused, but the rest would not get any compensation. And I sort of brought up our case where everyone whose rights were deprived was eligible for compensation. And so they really pressed that issue with the government. In fact, they even threatened to go to court over that because there was a precedent. And then the government backed down and they accepted a model similar to what we have where they gave so much per year that they were in residential schools. So that's sort of the past. But at the present time, I know that in Winnipeg, we've been involved with the Indigenous group. We've been holding sharing circles with them, sharing our story, and they share theirs. And we did that recently with also with the Asian community as well as the Black community. And so we are trying to share get some of our experiences out to other people, and they in turn have their own experiences that they want to share with us. So it's a two-way street, and I think it's important to do that because um, I think the communication amongst our groups are much better as a result of that contact. And they keep saying to me, "When are we having another one where we get together as a large group?" And in fact, we do have a project that's underway for next year to do that again. But talking to each other, I think, is likely the most part. And every organization has the ability to be able to do that as long as there's a willingness to do it, because I'm sure the other communities would like to do that as well. So that's a challenge I think, for our own communities.
So I just kind of want to take off on the question that Kevin just mentioned and indicate that the Canadian Race Relations Foundation was part of the redress settlement, and part of that, their mandate is to go out and do education on human rights issues as well as what has happened with Japanese Canadians. I also want to mention that there's a lot of things happening across the country on lots of projects with respect to human rights. But here in Edmonton, our Human Rights Committee has been able to get some curriculum put together around the Japanese issues and have presented it to the Minister of Education. So there's a lot of work that's being done. I just want to let the audience know that there's been a number of books that both Art and America have written around redress and some of the political actions that have been taken, many articles. And there's a lot of other individuals who are involved with that process who have also written a lot of information. So individuals who are interested in reading more, there's lots of different resources available. I guess my next question is, because we were kind of the forefront of political action in getting this redress, which is monumental because we've been able to help a lot of other groups. Where do you see the Japanese community now and the things that we could potentially do? I mean, you've mentioned some of that, but what could we do in the way of human rights to help human rights movements and a lot of the issues? Because I know that there's been differing opinions about the political stances that might be taken around specific human rights issues. So I'm just throwing that out there as kind of an open question.
Well, he told me I could comment a bit on that. I know I just go back the time that we had the redress rally in April of 1988, and David Suzuki was there. And I think one of the things he said to us, he says, it will be our obligation, there's redress because of the community, it will be our obligation to be the first to step forward when there are other groups that are being ostracized or deprived of their rights. And I took that seriously because I think the National Association Japanese Canadian, the Human Rights Committee is likely the most important aspect of it. And, sometimes there are issues that need to be addressed. There's sometimes reluctance to do that, but I think we still, as a community, have that strong obligation to be one of the leading voices when it comes to things like that because of what happened to our own community. And so even with the present issues today with the Hamas and Israel situation, I think our voices should be there. I know that there's some reluctance to do that, but my God, when there are problems such as that, if we ignore it, we're going to have the same problems again. So it's just a comment, but I think it's important that our role is very. I think the NAJC certainly has a very important role to play, and I'm not too sure whether we're doing enough of it today. So.
Erica or Suzanne, do you have any comments?
Well, how do you follow that? It's interesting again in this current media environment where everything is pushed to the extremes. Just the way that the algorithms are built in the social media environment. So there's a lot in doing this human rights work that gets lost because a lot of it is nuanced work. And the context is also nuanced. And so you see these extremely loud ends of the spectrum going, on different issues. And perhaps the NAJC's role moving forward could be to really take a look at the issues, maybe, right? A deeper look at issues and maybe, present an independent voice on what is happening, using all of its own experience as a people who were violently experienced state violence, and use it in a different way. It's challenging in this kind of media environment. It really is.
It is, yeah.
I'm aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, the three of you are still very much involved in human rights and some of the fights that are going on, and going out and making connections. How do you as an individual stay with the fight? Because there's days where you feel like you're fighting Goliath, and how do you as an individual continue on that fight?
Well, that's a tough question. I do want to make reference to one situation, and it was when we had the Russian attack on the Ukraine and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and there was a lot of support for Ukrainians across the country. And I remember I did a little article for CBC on that because they were asking me what I thought of what was happening. And I was mentioning to them the thing, it appeared one-sided because I was thinking of the Japanese-Canadian experience when the threat of war and we're being removed, people didn't speak up for us. But I was thinking in the situation with the Ukraine, you had the Russian Canadians who are now being attacked in their own country. And there wasn't much said about that. It seemed so one-sided. So I wrote this article for the CBC on that. And, a number of people commented that, yes, there's always two sides to the situation and that we have to be cognizant of it. And so the Japanese Canadian experience really relates to that kind of thing. We need to look at how a small, minority group can be quite ostracized without, without really people thinking much about it. So, anyway, that's.
And I just wanted to, can I comment, Hitomi, on what Art just said? Because I took note of that article that he did. And in fact, he is the only Japanese Canadian that I've seen who took that position and was willing to write to that subject. He's the only one.
So I'm sure there's lots of questions that I could still ask. I'm also conscious of time. I'm just wondering if the three of you might have just some final words of advice around tackling human rights within the framework of the current climate and the upward battle that we constantly work with in human rights, that it just seems like a ongoing battle that we do one thing and there's many other battles to go. And so do you have any last minute words about how we as organizations or individuals can help with that fight?
Well, I am a member of the NAJC Human Rights Committee, and I urge, if there are people from other organizations, that they have a human rights committee, and in that way they in the organization can be involved in issues outside of our community, because some of the things that we talk about are things like the anti-Islam and anti-Semitism that is currently going around the country and what we can do about it. From the early days, that is, say from the 1980s, our community has tried to forge links with the Indigenous community. And Joy Kogawa, a renowned writer in our community, was very essential early on in trying to forge that link. And we know by reading the papers every day and seeing the media that they have many unresolved issues. And I'm glad and I hope that our community will strengthen our bond with that community and provide any support that we can in their struggle.
Yeah, I agree. I think I know that one of the things that we're trying to do here in Winnipeg is bring, especially during COVID when we had anti-racism, anti-Black, you had the Indigenous issue with the graves and so on. And so we brought all three groups together and we talked about some of those things. And unless you get them together and people share, to me, that's the best step forward in combating racism is the communication. And somehow we need to keep doing more of that. And I know I met with Peter Flago, who was with the government body of anti-racism. And he was in Winnipeg. I met with him. He said, one of the difficulties is getting all of the three groups together, the Black, the Indigenous. And meanwhile, we were doing that. He said, how do you go about it? And the question is, the answer is very simple. I said, you call them, you contact them, and you say, look, would you like to get together and do something? And that's how we get people together. And so sometimes we may have to make an effort to just say, let's do it, rather than waiting for someone to do it for you. So just a comment.
Yeah, I like, that just do it thing is really important. I think if you stay true to your beliefs and stay true to what you believe in, you will always find people like yourself that will be interested in doing the work. And I guess one of my takeaways is one size doesn't fit all. So never, don't, when you go to do an initiative or have a conference or get a group together, you don't need to take care of the entire all people. You're working within groups, and I think to keep a clear focus, I think, on the work and the people that you're working with, recognizing that there's just many different ways to have a conversation, right?
Yeah.
And there's different ways to express your your political action, etc. And that's just that's the world we live in, and the most important thing is to do it.
One
Well,
thing that
one of
helps,
the projects I'm working on is using the arts as a focus, and so I just we have some funding to bring people together. So bringing writers from the Asian community, the Black community, Indigenous community all together and talking about issues. And so it's activities such as that will likely help. So we need to continue to focus on things like that.
one thing that you will require if you're going to be approaching government for money is the facts. And BC Redress was really helped by having the Landscapes of Injustice collective from the University of Victoria. They had a huge SHRC grant, and they uncovered all kinds of information which I had not known. And when we went against the federal government in the 80s, we thought that basically the federal government using the War Measures Act had done everything. But Landscapes of Injustice showed that it was the BC politicians and even the BC people who were pushing for our incarceration and for taking all our property. And that, I think, was a pretty solid case. And I think it really helps to have a solid case when you're going and trying to win justice for your cause.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for taking time out in your busy schedules, because I know you're all very busy with your own projects and participating. But I think that one of the things that we wanted to do with the John Humphrey Center was to present a panel on what the Japanese community did to be so successful with political action. And yeah, we're a small community, but we managed to come up with great strides and have helped many other communities with their political actions as well. And I just want to thank Suzanne and Art and America for all of the work that they've done to continue this fight for human rights and do it within the political realms that they have in their respective provinces. I wish we had an audience to clap hands, but I mean, it's monumental the amount of work that you have done. And I think that I just want to remind our participants that tomorrow we're going to be developing this. There is a theme throughout all of the presentations with the Japanese community because we've tried to connect them. And tomorrow I'll be presenting on the citizenship and what it's meant within the War Measures Act. And then in the afternoon, we'll also have a session on the human rights committees and what the National Japanese Association and our locals have done with the human rights committee. So I would urge all of our participants to take their time out tomorrow and attend these. We have some other sessions. We also have a session tomorrow night with respect to Gordon Hirabayashi, who was also very instrumental in doing his part in the human rights race as well. So I want to thank you. I also want to just thank the John Humphrey Center once again for allowing us to have this discussion, and all of our technicians who helped us along the way, Ed and Jessica and Emily. So thank everyone, and I appreciate the three of you, and see you in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hitomi.
Yeah, really appreciate your words. Thank you, Hitomi. That was great.
Thank you, Hitomi, and thank you, audience.
Good to see you.
Nice to see you, and nice to see that audience.
Okay.
All right.